We are often too quick to accuse ourselves of laziness, as though the soul were merely a machine refusing to start. We say, I am weak. I have no discipline. I simply do not try hard enough. Yet this may not be the truth at all. It is possible that what we call laziness is not idleness, but escape, an instinct carefully practiced, almost perfected over years of avoiding discomfort. The human mind is a clever servant but a dangerous master. It learns swiftly where pain lies in rejection, in failure and effort, in the slow humiliation of beginning badly. And once it has learned this, it does not ask whether the pain is necessary. It simply teaches you to run. Not dramatically, not with rebellion, but quietly, through delay, distraction, endless scrolling, harmless excuses, and the comforting lie that tomorrow will feel easier. You do not wake each morning and consciously choose mediocrity. More often you obey an old training. You move toward comfort as naturally as water runs downhill, and you call this your personality. But comfort, when worshipped, becomes a kind of prison. It promises peace and delivers paralysis. The tragedy is not that people are weak, but that they mistake self-protection for peace. They defend themselves from the very struggle that might have made them free. We are often far too eager to condemn ourselves with the word lazy. It is a harsh little word, and because it is simple, we trust it. We look at unfinished work, abandoned goals, mornings wasted in hesitation, and we pronounce judgment with almost religious certainty. I am lazy. It feels honest, even noble, to accuse oneself so directly. Yet honesty is not merely saying something severe, it is saying something true. Laziness, as we commonly imagine it, suggests a person who simply does not care, someone who refuses effort because comfort is sweeter than purpose. But human beings are rarely so simple. More often, what appears to be laziness is not the love of idleness, but the habit of escape. It is not that a person does not wish to move forward. It is that something in them has quietly learned to retreat. The mind is always learning, even when we think we are standing still. A child who is mocked for speaking too boldly may grow into an adult who calls himself naturally quiet, never noticing that silence was first chosen as protection. A student who once failed publicly may begin postponing every serious attempt, not because ambition has died, but because humiliation left a mark deeper than he admits. What we call personality is often a history of survival. So too with discipline. When effort has repeatedly been tied to pain, failure, criticism, rejection, disappointment, the mind begins to associate action itself with danger. It learns that trying is risky, that caring invites suffering, that beginning exposes weakness. And because the mind is built in part to protect us, it develops a strategy: avoid the pain by avoiding the attempt. This strategy is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with a declaration of surrender. It comes quietly, dressed in ordinary clothes. It says, I will start tomorrow. It whispers, I need to feel more ready first. It offers small comforts. One more hour of sleep, one more harmless distraction, one more evening spent planning instead of doing. It does not feel like self-destruction. It feels like self-preservation. That is why laziness is often misunderstood. The man staring at his work for hours, unable to begin, is not always lacking desire. Sometimes he desires success so much that failure terrifies him. The woman delaying her dream is not always careless. Sometimes she cares so deeply that disappointment feels unbearable. They do not avoid effort because they are indifferent. They avoid it because they are afraid. Fear is patient. It is content to hide beneath labels like procrastination or low motivation. In fact, calling oneself lazy can be strangely comforting because it keeps the problem shallow. If I am merely lazy, then perhaps I need only stronger willpower. But if I am escaping pain, then I must face older wounds, buried assumptions, and the uncomfortable truth that I have been protecting myself in ways that are now destroying me. There is a peculiar sadness in this. A person may spend years blaming character for what was actually conditioning. They may build an identity around failure. This is just who I am. When in truth they are simply repeating a lesson learned long ago. The prison becomes familiar, and familiarity often disguises itself as fate. Yet there is also hope here, because what is learned can be unlearned. If laziness is not a fixed defect but a practiced escape, then change is not a miracle reserved for the gifted. It is a retraining of the soul. One begins not by waiting to feel fearless, but by recognizing fear for what it is and refusing to let it speak with the voice of destiny. To say, I am lazy, is to close the case too quickly. To ask instead, what pain am I trying to avoid, is far more dangerous but also far more honest. It forces us to look beneath the surface, where excuses lose their elegance and patterns reveal their roots. Most people do not need more shame, they need clearer sight. They need to see that the problem is not always a lack of desire, but a mind trained, over years, to confuse discomfort with danger. And once the mind learns that lesson, it obeys it faithfully even when the cost is a life half lived. The mind left to itself does not naturally seek greatness, it seeks safety. We often imagine that human beings are drawn instinctively toward growth, as though courage were our default setting and discipline, merely a matter of remembering our better nature. But much of ordinary life suggests the opposite. We are not first trained to pursue what is good for us, we are first trained to avoid what hurts us. Pain is an excellent teacher, though not always a wise one. It leaves impressions quickly. A single moment of embarrassment can outlive years of praise. One public failure can become more powerful in memory than 10 quiet successes. The mind notices these things with remarkable loyalty. It marks them, stores them, and builds invisible boundaries around them. This is why growth so often feels unnatural. Growth usually requires entering the very places where pain once lived. To speak with confidence after being mocked, to love after betrayal, to try again after failure, to remain consistent after disappointment. The mind does not greet these moments as opportunities for transformation, it often greets them as threats. A person may say they want success, and they may mean it sincerely, yet when the path toward that success demands vulnerability, effort, uncertainty, or the possibility of rejection, another force begins to speak. It does not argue loudly, it simply creates resistance. Sudden tiredness appears, motivation vanishes, small distractions become strangely urgent. One begins cleaning the room instead of writing the proposal, checking messages instead of making the call, researching endlessly instead of beginning. This is not always weakness of character. Often it is the mind attempting to protect itself from anticipated pain. It has learned that discomfort is dangerous, and so it treats avoidance as wisdom. The tragedy is that pain and growth are frequently neighbors. The very act that threatens the ego may be the one that strengthens the soul. Yet the mind is not interested in long-term meaning when short-term discomfort is at hand. It prefers immediate relief. It says, stay where it is familiar. Delay what feels uncertain. Protect yourself now and become better later. A later, of course, is a kingdom many people never reach. Comfort has a persuasive voice because it rarely presents itself as surrender. It arrives as reasonableness. It says, today has been difficult. Rest a little longer. It says, you should wait until you feel more confident. It says, there is no harm in postponing this once. And because these things contain fragments of truth, they are difficult to resist. Rest is necessary, confidence matters. Delay can be harmless, but the mind once trained to escape pain turns occasional mercy into permanent retreat. One begins to build a life around avoidance. Not dramatic avoidance, but subtle arrangements of safety. Dreams are reduced to manageable sizes. Conversations are kept shallow to avoid rejection. Talents remain undeveloped because practice would expose imperfection. Ambition is renamed, being realistic. Peace is confused with the absence of challenge. This is why so many people feel stuck while appearing functional. They are not inactive, they are merely active in circles that demand little risk. They move but never forward. They remain busy but never transformed. The mind prefers this arrangement because it values certainty over possibility. It would rather suffer familiar disappointment than risk unfamiliar failure. There is a certain comfort even in misery, provided it is predictable. Yet a life governed entirely by pain avoidance becomes strangely small. One may preserve themselves so carefully that they never truly live. They become like a man who refuses to sail because storms exist, forgetting that harbors were never meant to be permanent homes. The difficulty is not that we do not know what should be done. Most people know with uncomfortable clarity, the call they keep postponing, the book unwritten, the apology unspoken, the habit unbroken, the responsibility delayed. Knowledge is seldom the issue. The issue is that action demands pain before it offers reward. Discipline, then, is not merely the triumph of willpower over laziness. It is the decision to stop treating every discomfort as a warning sign. It is the slow retraining of the mind to understand that effort is not injury, that rejection is not death, that failure is not identity. The soul matures when it learns to endure the temporary sting of growth, rather than obey the immediate pull of escape. For the mind will always offer the nearest exit, and if left unquestioned, it will gladly protect you from the very life you were meant to build. Comfort is one of the most innocent-looking dangers in human life. It does not arrive like an enemy. It comes as a friend, soft, spoken, and reasonable, offering relief after effort, rest after struggle, and shelter from disappointment. It asks for so little at first that we scarcely notice the bargain being made. We welcome it without suspicion, because comfort rarely feels like surrender. It feels like peace. There is nothing wrong with comfort in its proper place. Rest is not weakness, and peace is not failure. A man who never pauses becomes as unhealthy as the man who never begins. But comfort becomes dangerous when it ceases to be a place we visit and becomes the place we refuse to leave. What was meant to restore us begins to rule us. The soul is strangely adaptable. Whatever environment it lives in long enough, it begins to call normal. If one continually chooses ease over effort, silence over necessary truth, distraction over reflection, then eventually discomfort itself feels unnatural. Challenge begins to seem like injustice. Responsibility feels like oppression. We no longer ask whether something is meaningful, only whether it is pleasant. This is the quiet beginning of the prison. Most prisons are obvious because they are built with walls. This one is more subtle because it is built with preferences. A person says, "I simply work better when I feel inspired," and what they mean is that they have become unwilling to labor without emotional permission. Another says, "I am protecting my peace," when in truth they are avoiding every conversation that might demand honesty or courage. We decorate our chains with noble language. Comfort is persuasive because it promises safety. It tells you that avoiding risk is wisdom, that preserving your present ease is maturity. It encourages small retreats that seem harmless on their own. Skip the difficult conversation. Delay the hard decision. Stay in the familiar place a little longer. Choose what is certain over what is possible. None of these choices appear tragic in isolation. The tragedy is in accumulation. A life can be quietly diminished by 1,000 harmless postponements. Dreams are not usually destroyed by one dramatic event, but by years of choosing convenience over calling. Potential dies politely. It fades beneath routines so ordinary that no one thinks to mourn them. There is a particular sadness in this because comfort often disguises itself as self-care. We live in an age eager to justify avoidance if it can be dressed in therapeutic language. Certainly, there are times when withdrawal is wisdom and rest is necessary. But there is a difference between healing and hiding. Healing prepares you to return to life. Hiding teaches you to fear it. The person devoted entirely to comfort becomes fragile. They mistake the absence of disturbance for strength, when in fact strength is proven by endurance. A tree does not grow strong because it is protected from every wind, but because it survives them. In the same way, character is not formed in perfect ease but in resistance. Yet many people spend years arranging their lives to avoid resistance altogether. They avoid rejection by never being fully known. They avoid failure by never attempting anything worthy of failure. They avoid heartbreak by loving cautiously, ambition by dreaming modestly, discipline by waiting for motivation. They call this balance, but often it is only fear made respectable. Comfort, when worshipped, shrinks the soul. It narrows the range of what a person believes they can endure. Every inconvenience becomes a crisis. Every challenge feels personal. One begins to expect life to cooperate with preference rather than shape character through hardship. And because comfort rewards immediately, it is difficult to question. Discipline feels painful now and useful later. Comfort feels useful now and painful later. Human beings, being impatient creatures, are easily persuaded by the first arrangement. The prison is quiet because it rarely feels like punishment. You may have food, entertainment, routine, and enough distraction to avoid noticing the emptiness. You may even appear successful to others. Yet somewhere beneath the surface there remains the dull ache of unrealized strength, the sense that you were made for more than maintenance. Freedom often begins with an unpleasant realization. The safe life may be the very thing suffocating you. The habits protecting your comfort may also be protecting your limitations. The walls were not forced upon you. They were built slowly, each brick chosen in the name of ease. To leave such a prison requires more than motivation. It requires suspicion toward the voice that always asks, "What is easiest?" and greater loyalty to the quieter voice asking, "What is necessary?" Because the soul does not become alive by being endlessly soothed. It becomes alive by being called into difficulty, responsibility, sacrifice, and the kind of purpose that demands more than comfort is willing to give. Procrastination is often spoken of as though it were a simple failure of time management, as though the cure were merely a better calendar, a stronger routine, or the discovery of some secret method used by disciplined people. We treat it like a technical problem, something mechanical and easy to diagnose. Yet anyone who has truly wrestled with procrastination knows it is rarely about time. It is about emotion. A person does not delay what is easy because they have forgotten the clock. They delay what unsettles them. The untouched work on the desk, the unanswered message, the decision postponed for weeks. These things are not usually neglected because they are unimportant, but because they carry weight. They threaten discomfort. They stir fear. They ask something from us that we are not eager to give. This is why procrastination is so deceptive. From the outside, it looks like laziness. From the inside, it often feels like self-defense. The mind has a remarkable talent for protecting itself from pain, even when the protection becomes destructive. If a task carries the possibility of failure, rejection, embarrassment, or inadequacy, the mind quietly searches for escape routes. It does not announce this honestly. It does not say, "I am afraid." Instead, it invents more respectable excuses. "I work better under pressure." I need to be in the right mood. I should prepare a little more first. These excuses are persuasive precisely because they are not entirely false. Preparation matters, timing matters, mood influences effort. But procrastination takes fragments of truth and turns them into shelters for fear. Consider the student who delays studying until the final night. It may appear that he simply lacks discipline, but often there is something more delicate beneath it. If he studies sincerely and still fails, he must face the possibility that his best was not enough. But if he delays and performs poorly, he can preserve a comforting illusion. I could have done better if I had really tried. Delay protects pride. The same is true in adulthood. The writer avoids beginning the book because unfinished potential feels safer than imperfect reality. The entrepreneur delays launching the idea because dreams are easier to love before the world is allowed to judge them. The person postpones difficult conversations because silence protects them from immediate conflict, even while slowly poisoning the relationship. Procrastination, then, is not always rebellion against responsibility. It is often emotional protection disguised as postponement. There is a certain tragedy in this, because what we avoid to preserve ourselves usually becomes the very thing that weakens us. The relief of delay is immediate, but temporary. The anxiety returns often heavier than before, carrying now the added burden of guilt. We escape discomfort for an hour and purchase greater discomfort for a week. This cycle creates a peculiar form of suffering. One begins to distrust oneself. Promises made in the morning are broken by evening. Ambition remains sincere, but action becomes unreliable. The person feels divided, as though two selves are constantly negotiating, the one who longs for growth and the one who worships relief. What makes procrastination especially dangerous is its quietness. It does not destroy life dramatically. It erodes it politely. Opportunities expire without announcement. Talent fades through neglect rather than failure. Relationships weaken not through one great betrayal, but through repeated small avoidances. Life is not ruined in a single decision, but in the habit of postponing decisions altogether. And yet many people continue to believe the answer is simply harsher self-criticism. They scold themselves for weakness, assuming shame will produce movement. But shame often strengthens procrastination, because it adds another layer of pain to the task. Now the work carries not only difficulty, but also self-contempt. The wiser question is not, why am I so lazy? But, what am I protecting myself from? That question reaches beneath behavior into motive. It exposes the hidden fear. Fear of imperfection, fear of judgment, fear of discovering limits we would rather not confront. To face procrastination honestly is to admit that avoidance is serving a purpose. It is not random, it is protective. The difficulty lies in realizing that protection can become imprisonment. A person can spend years guarding themselves from failure so carefully that they never build anything worth failing at. Courage, then, is not the absence of procrastination, but the willingness to act while discomfort remains. It is the refusal to demand emotional certainty before obedience. It is understanding that the task will not always feel lighter tomorrow, and that peace is not found in endless delay, but in the dignity of beginning before you feel entirely ready. Excuses are among the gentlest forms of self-deception. They do not shout, and they do not often appear wicked. They arrive quietly, dressed in reason, carrying enough truth to make them believable. That is why they are so dangerous. A lie that looks like a lie is easy to resist. A lie that resembles wisdom is far more difficult to detect. Most people do not ruin themselves through dramatic rebellion against what is right. They do it through small permissions granted to weakness. Just this once. Tomorrow will be better. I am waiting for the right moment. These phrases seem harmless because they are ordinary, yet a life is often shaped more by ordinary words than by extraordinary decisions. Excuses thrive wherever responsibility meets discomfort. The moment action becomes inconvenient, the mind begins its quiet negotiation. It searches not for truth but for relief. It asks, not, what must be done, but how may I avoid doing it without feeling guilty? And because human beings are remarkably skilled advocates for their own comfort, the argument is usually persuasive. A man knows he should rise earlier, but tells himself he works better at night. A woman knows she must leave a destructive situation, but insists the timing is not yet right. A student avoids disciplined study because he convinces himself pressure sharpens performance. None of these people are necessarily dishonest in the obvious sense. They believe themselves. That is the power of excuses. They allow surrender without the humiliation of calling it surrender. Excuses are attractive because they protect identity. If I fail because I never truly tried, then perhaps I may still believe I am capable. If I delay responsibility, I may continue imagining a better version of myself waiting somewhere in the future. Reality remains negotiable as long as commitment is postponed. There is comfort in potential because potential cannot be measured. Action, however, exposes truth. The moment you begin, your strengths and weaknesses become visible. Effort removes illusion. Discipline demands contact with reality, and reality is often less flattering than imagination. This is why excuses multiply near important things. We make the grandest justifications around the very work that matters most. Our purpose, our growth, our healing, our calling. We do not invent elaborate excuses for things we do not care about. We invent them where obedience would require sacrifice. The soul prefers fantasy because fantasy is painless. In fantasy, we are disciplined tomorrow, courageous next month, transformed next year. In fantasy, we are always on the verge of becoming. Excuses keep us loyal to this imaginary future while quietly stealing the present. Discipline begins at the moment this illusion becomes unbearable. It begins when a person grows tired of listening to themselves explain their own inaction. There is a certain exhaustion that comes not from hard work, but from repeated avoidance. One becomes wary of promises made and broken, of plans endlessly revised, of the subtle humiliation of knowing one's words no longer carry authority even to oneself. At some point, excuses lose their elegance. They begin to sound repetitive, thin, almost embarrassing. The phrase, "I will start tomorrow," reveals itself for what it has always been, not a strategy, but a ritual of delay. One sees, perhaps painfully, that the obstacle was not mystery but unwillingness. This recognition is unpleasant because it removes the romance of self-deception. It is easier to blame circumstances than to admit comfort was chosen, easier to accuse fate than to confess fear. Yet freedom often begins with the humiliation of clarity. Discipline is not born from inspiration. It is born from the refusal to negotiate with every passing preference. It is the decision that what is necessary will no longer be held hostage by what feels pleasant. It is choosing action when excuses still sound convincing. This does not mean becoming harsh or mechanical. It means becoming honest. It means seeing that the mind will always offer a softer path, and understanding that softness is not always kindness. Sometimes the most loving act is not self-soothing, but self-command. There is dignity in this. A person who stops making excuses does not become perfect, they become trustworthy. They begin to recover authority over their own life. Their words and actions slowly reunite. They discover that strength is not the absence of weakness, but the refusal to let weakness make every decision. The first victory of discipline is often invisible. It is not success, applause, or dramatic transformation. It is the quiet moment when an excuse appears familiar and persuasive, and for the first time, it is not believed. Most people imagine freedom as the absence of difficulty. They picture a life without pressure, without discomfort, without the constant demands of responsibility. Freedom, in this understanding, means ease, the ability to do what one wants when one wants, without resistance. It is a pleasant idea, and for that reason, a deeply misleading one. Ease and freedom are not the same thing. In fact, they are often opposites. A life built entirely around avoiding discomfort may feel comfortable for a season, but it rarely remains free. What begins as convenience slowly becomes dependence. What feels like escape becomes captivity. Consider the man who avoids difficult work because he prefers immediate pleasure. At first, this seems like liberty. He follows appetite rather than discipline, comfort rather than structure. Yet over time, he discovers he is no longer choosing pleasure, he is obeying it. His habits govern him more faithfully than principles ever did. He is not free because he can indulge every impulse. He is less free because he cannot resist them. This is the hidden nature of comfort. It promises release from pain, but if made a master, it creates chains. The person who cannot endure boredom becomes a servant to distraction. The person who cannot endure loneliness becomes a prisoner of unhealthy attachment. The person who cannot endure failure becomes trapped in permanent hesitation. In every case, the refusal of temporary discomfort leads to a deeper, quieter form of slavery. Freedom does not come by removing all resistance. It comes by becoming strong enough to face resistance without surrendering to it. There is something in human nature that resists this truth, because discomfort feels like an enemy. We assume pain must always be avoided, as though every difficult thing were harmful. But much of what gives life meaning arrives through strain. Love demands sacrifice. Growth requires humility. Discipline asks repetition. Forgiveness wounds pride. Purpose often begins where convenience ends. To avoid all discomfort is to avoid much of what makes a soul alive. The athlete understands this more clearly than the philosopher. Strength is not built by protecting the body from strain, but by subjecting it to strain wisely. Muscles grow through resistance, not ease. Character follows a similar law. Patience is formed by waiting, courage by fear, endurance by difficulty. Virtue is not inherited through comfort, it is shaped through opposition. Yet many people continue to search for a painless path to transformation. They wait for motivation before discipline, certainty before action, confidence before responsibility. They believe freedom will arrive once life becomes easier, not realizing that life often becomes easier only after one becomes stronger. This misunderstanding keeps people trapped. They interpret discomfort as proof they are on the wrong path, when often it is evidence they are finally on the right one. The beginning of discipline feels unnatural precisely because indulgence has been practiced for so long. The first honest conversation feels frightening because avoidance was once mistaken for peace. There is a cruel irony here. The path that feels easier now often becomes harder later, and the path that feels harder now often becomes freedom later. Avoiding exercise is easier today, but weakness becomes difficult. Avoiding truth is easier today, but false peace becomes heavy. Avoiding responsibility is easier today, but dependence becomes humiliating. Pain deferred is rarely pain removed. This is why discipline is not punishment, but liberation. It is not the enemy of joy, it is often the condition for deeper joy. A person who governs appetite rather than serving it experiences a peace comfort alone cannot provide. A person who learns to endure temporary discomfort gains access to opportunities fear would have denied. There is dignity in being able to trust oneself, to rise when one has promised to rise, to continue when enthusiasm fades, to remain faithful when convenience offers a softer bargain. Such things may look restrictive from the outside, but inwardly they create a profound kind of freedom, the freedom of not being ruled by every passing mood. The person who learns this discovers that freedom is not found by escaping difficulty, but by passing through it. The road is narrower than comfort would prefer, and often lonelier. It asks surrender of excuses, sacrifice of habits, and the willingness to meet pain without immediately fleeing from it. But on the other side of that discomfort is something far richer than ease, self-respect, strength, clarity, and the quiet authority of a life no longer governed by fear. The chains were never in the struggle itself, but in the endless attempt to avoid it.